Thank you very much, Robin. Well, it wasn't so long ago, as a professor of geography at a university in England, I would find myself setting questions about this time of year for final year students, saying, in the context of the challenge of climate change, is the role of the World Bank part of the problem or part of the solution? I think what Robin has said today, and there is much more to make the point, that they've made this transition, thankfully and at last. And Bob Watson was instrumental, I think, to some extent in this, to being most definitely part of the solution. And this dual approach that you were talking about, I can see is now well embedded in policy at the highest level in the World Bank and other international institutions. Well, that's crucial because tackling this issue at risk is something we can only hope to achieve from both ends, as it were, this dual approach. And that's why we wanted Walter Ammann to speak to us from the Global Risk Forum, as it's now called, in Davos, because for long he's been leading an impressive team working on the understanding at risk. And he's going to speak to us on 10 key factors in the climate change risk debate. Walter, thank you for coming. Look forward to you.
Thank you very much, Martin, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, let me thank the organizer for the opportunity to address some key aspects. As an engineer, what I used to be in my former life, I feel very much honored and privileged to give a talk in a social sciences environment. What I would like to do within the next couple of minutes is to address 10 key aspects in climate change debate from a disasters reduction perspective. The first point has already been mentioned by Wolfgang Schmidt and Robin just before in terms of the number, intensity, and especially the consequences of natural disasters such as floods, droughts, tropical cyclones, and so on are increasing as a consequence of climate change. And that they afflict and their impact in terms of lives lost and livelihoods disrupted tends to fall most heavily on the poor in developing countries. The effects of these disasters and other climate-related impacts like water scarcity, hunger, malnutrition, food security, or vector-borne diseases are putting unbearable stress on these communities with already limited basic capacities, resources, institutions, services, and infrastructure. This constitutes not just an environmental, but a serious humanitarian concern which also endangers human rights, socio-economic, sustainable development, and welfare. The second point, the human face of climate change. Climate change will threaten the sustainability of development progress and undermine progress towards poverty reduction. Once more, the world's poorest, those who are, as we just have seen, least responsible for climate change, are suffering the brunt of the consequences. Climate change thus primarily becomes a tragic human face asking for responsibilities to be taken by those nations who are emitting most and contributing most to climate change, as it represents an additional unbearable burden to the world's poorest. The human face of climate change is global. A global solidarity, therefore, is needed to meet the challenges imposed by climate change. The third point, disproportionality. In an already fragile situation, climate change is having a disproportionate adverse impact on the world's poorest again and most vulnerable populations, placing them under multiple stresses. The growing intensity of climate change is set to create one of the most significant humanitarian challenges of our time. Many of the world's poor already live in harsh environments. Many already struggle to ensure their own survival, or that of their families and live in communities lacking even the most basic services. The fourth issue is with regard to redefinition of the development goals. To cope with climate change needs a redefinition of development. When the Millennium Development Goals were agreed upon in the year 2000, climate change was not taken into account. Now it is a serious threat to almost the entire spectrum of development targets, including progress made so far. Development, therefore, must not only be sustainable, but also climate-proof. In addition, adaptation is more effective when implemented in combination with development strategies. At the same time, development itself can be the most effective form of adaptation for most vulnerable communities. Development also needs energy. The lack of any modern forms of energy for some 1.6 billion people is a major impediment to development progress. There is therefore also an urgent need to energize development and the MDGs by providing access to modern energy services for the poor. An environmentally friendly energy will be an additional positive contribution towards resolving the climate problem. Fifth point, climate justice. Every polluter is a global player in terms of the sometimes far distant impact of the consequences of his emissions. Polluters, and above all advanced economies, have an obligation to enable developing countries to pursue sustainable economic growth. Climate justice is realized when polluters take responsibility for their actions on a global perspective. Climate justice should be the basis of the international community's response to climate change and of any future global climate agreement, and be at the top of each political agenda. The poor require more support than other groups to adapt to climate change and reduce emissions associated with continued development. On a global level, therefore, an international mechanism must be established to transfer funds, knowledge, solutions, and technologies. As we know at present, an annual amount of about 100 billion euro will be necessary. If the current financial crisis has one advantage, we get familiar with big numbers, so that the 100 billion euro still seem very modest compared to the 15,000 billion which have been spent up to now to stabilize the global, sometimes virtual financial system. Governments and international institutions should encourage investment in climate protective, sustainable business in order to accelerate private sector-driven adaptation, particularly in the least developed economies. Prince Charles P8 initiative might be a good example in that direction. The sixth point, the role of science. Climate change has long been understood and also communicated as an environmental or ecological concern, or a problem for the distant future. This focus on environment and ecology, thus on the natural sciences, might be one of the major reasons why the social sciences, as it came out on the Monday's panel discussion, feel underrepresented in the global change debate. I do not know the composition of IPCC in terms of the different science sectors involved, and there is no doubt I highly admire the work of that IPCC has done in the past.